had a number of the courageous students of all colors at the University of Virginia who were protesting against the neo-fascists themselves. The neo-fascists had their own ammunition, and this is very important to keep in mind because the police, for the most part, pulled back. The next day, for example, although the 20 of us who were standing, many of them clergy, we would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists who approached over 350 anti-fascists. We just had 20. But that is just the theater. It's big money, it's big military, and the way in which this capitalist civilization is leading us toward unbelievable darkness and bleakness. And the beautiful thing is to fight back. It was a beautiful thing to see all the people coming back, but they had more fascists than anarchists.
Welcome, once again, to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York. As Trump's America becomes more and more embroiled and grapples with the legacy of what Martin Luther King referred to as the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, more and more Americans are coming out in a variety of ways to resist, confront, and transform a country sliding and lurching toward a full-blown American version of a neo-fascist state. The president calling for the firing of football players who kneel during the national anthem. An ESPN female sports commentator threatened with a firing after a negative tweet of the president. Threatening to lock up your presidential opponent. The expansion of wars around the globe and the growing militarization of the police at home. Increasing economic inequality, creating a false moral equivalency of neo-Nazi agitators in Charlottesville and resistors to their violence and threats of violence are just some of the numerous examples we could cite of the back and forth struggle and forms of resistance going on in America. The American university is, of course, not exempt from attempts by political and administrative elites to regulate and control intellectual and academic policies and activities. The academy also has a long history of being a cauldron of resistance and struggle, a sometimes beacon of light as to how to critique and move forward on social issues. Today's guest on the Radical Imagination is an adjunct economics professor at John Jay College who is in the middle of a maelstrom of incrimination, threats, and suspension from his job as a result of a tweet message he sent out a few weeks ago. A suspension, by the way, advocated by the heads of the various police unions in New York and New York's progressive mayor, the chancellor of the city university system, and the president of John Jay College, the recently appointed Carol Mason, who called his statements abhorrent. Before we get to the tweeted statement and introduce our guest and his side to all of this, I'd like to briefly review a couple of other historically political academic moments in John Jay College's history. A former radical who served 16 years in federal prison for possession of explosives was forced out of teaching at John Jay in 2004 after then President Jeremy Travis acquiesced to an outcry from police organizations and officers in Rockland County calling for her dismissal. Susan Rosenberg had been teaching a writing course since the fall of 2002 at John Jay after her 58-year prison sentence was commuted by President Bill Clinton in 2001. Travis, by the way, a former deputy commissioner of the NYPD, had become president of John Jay in August and stated that Rosenberg's contract would not be would be renewed for the fall semester of that year, 2004. 13 years later, in the fall semester of 2017, Travis's newly appointed successor, Carol Mason, in a recent email concerning the relationship between the college and the Charles Koch Foundation, stated that the General Counsel of Koch Industries has been a very vocal supporter of criminal justice reform and supported being transparent about the support John Jay receives from Koch Industries. Her position seems oblivious to the massive monetary efforts by the Kochs to rebrand themselves and influence academic activity around the country through targeted grants and donations to colleges and other means to promote their corporate agenda, to influence the criminal justice system's ability to force them to pay for their environmental crimes. And it also flies in the face of President Travis's previous statements that the Koch brothers were not supporting college research at John Jay, as far as he knew. The Kochs are well known for their opposition to public employee unions, environmental protections, the Affordable Care Act, voter suppression tactics, climate denier research, and the National Rifle Association Stand Your Ground legislation. Their political ideology has been described as just to the right of Attila the Hun. To further carry on our discussion of an increasingly politicized John Jay College of resistance and potential progressive transformation, focusing on a criminal justice system driven by racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, I'd like to welcome the economist and Antifa supporter, Professor Mike Isaacson, to the Radical Imagination. So welcome, welcome, Mike, to the Radical Imagination. I'm really glad you have taken the opportunity to come visit us, and let's hear the sort of issues that you've been involved in and the infamous or famous tweet here that got you in trouble in the first place.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here, Jim.
Yes.
So what I want to, I guess, start with is that this did not start with the tweet. The tweet came out as a result of me speaking openly and honestly about my support for Antifa and my involvement in anti-fascist activity.
And this was where now?
So this was
classroom,
yeah. So this started actually with an article that came out in The Hill on, I guess it was 2 Thursdays ago. So I did that interview on over Labor Day weekend. It finally came out about 3 weeks later, and just so happened to coincide with the start of the so-called Free Speech Week at Berkeley. So my comments there, which were taken out of context and misrepresented, were taken to be a response to what was happening at Berkeley. That was then picked up by Newsweek, and by that point, a group called Far Left Watch, which is a group that targets left-leaning professors and students, started rooting through my tweets and my personal life to try to find anything that they could by which to defame me. And so they found, among other things, they found this one tweet. And so by the time I went on Tucker Carlson that night,
Fox News,
who reached out to me because of the article in The Hill, my name had become associated with the various things that Far Left Watch had found.
But the tweet was the statement that sort of got everybody.
Sure. And the interesting thing too is that the tweet itself was actually part of a 3-tweet series. The second of which also drew a bit of ire, but not as much as the first tweet, it seems. The second tweet was staged as a hypothetical revolution in which basically the same apparatus of the state is turned back around against the police.
Okay, and so take us one step. Okay, so the first part of the tweet
says,
can you paraphrase or whatever?
I believe that the first part of the tweet in full read, y'all might think it's weird for an anti-fascist to be teaching at John Jay, but I think it's a privilege to teach future dead cops.
That it sucks.
Right.
To okay. But you could now. Okay, so you consider it a privilege to
and I do
teach
future dead cops.
Okay, that was
the first tweet. The second tweet framed a hypothetical scenario in which there was a communist revolution of some sort, in which the same apparatus of the state that the police enforce daily is then turned back against them. And it
Against the police.
Against the police. And it turns out that police don't like it so much when they are on the other side of the barrel of that gun.
So this was the second
Right.
part of the comment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
My position in general is that policing is an institution.
And the third part now?
The third part was indicating that it was a joke about the revolution. Yeah.
Very important.
Right. So
Okay.
the ultimate point of the tweet series was in many ways pedagogical, indicating that we have a system in which violence.
This is really what, if I may. So this is really what was behind your thinking and the
Right.
motives here.
Yeah.
Okay. The pedagogical
So ultimately,
lesson that you wanted to give.
right. So ultimately, policing is a system of asymmetric violence, right? Where we have a state apparatus that, according to a Princeton study in 2013, is very much not representative of the population that it's supposed to serve. And the police ultimately operate as agents of that state apparatus and ultimately perform the violence that is required to maintain the terms of that state apparatus. And so my ultimate aim, and this is both in my teaching and in my activism, is to try to reconfigure the world to be a place where policing does not have to exist, where we can replace it with institutions that serve the tasks that of reducing social harm that police are put in the position of, but do so in democratic and directly engaged ways on the parts of communities.
And it should be emphasized that you're doing this in the classroom.
For sure.
With students who are
interested.
police officers, or many who are,
Right.
or and some who will become police officers. So this is not anything,
Right. And
secret, hidden stuff.
Right, and
Okay.
and these students, by and large, they're going into policing for all the right reasons, and I feel like
Which is what now?
Which is they want to help their communities, they want to keep people safe, they want to serve and
idealistic.
protect. I mean, exactly, and I don't think they're stupid for being idealistic. I mean, we're taught from a very young age that police officers are these heroes of the community. But at the end of the day, they are in the position of having to follow the orders of their superiors. Otherwise, they're going to get fired. So I mean, there have been numerous examples where police have actually been fired for not using deadly or escalated force. So there was a case out in West Virginia, I believe, 2 years ago, in which a police officer was fired because he refused to shoot a man who was wielding a gun and having a mental health episode. There was another case out in California
right?
State, Monterey, where a police officer was again facing an assailant with a weapon and chose not to use his taser, and again was fired from the force for refusing to escalate to the use of non-lethal force in that case. But the point is that we ultimately have policies, police policies in place, and police training in place that encourages this use of violence because it is ultimately profitable for the weapons industry and for the prison industry. Every time that a taser is deployed, that taser has to be reconfigured so that it can be used again, and that is ultimately more money for taser. Every time that a gun is fired, that means that you have to replenish the bullets, which is ultimately money for Smith & Wesson or whatever other companies happen to be making these weapons. So
you have this free-flowing debate
right.
in dialogue in the classroom.
Yes.
And students say what to you?
So, so the last lecture in my class is actually on racism, or on discrimination and policing. Not discrimination in policing, but discrimination and policing, where I talk about the economic theories of discrimination, how we have a system basically set up where by virtue of workers being alienated, in other words, being independent from each other, socially removed from each other, in competition with each other, will use whatever advantage that they have at their disposal in order to get a job, and bosses, on the other hand, will do whatever they can to increase their profits, which includes threatening, for example, white workers with being replaced with black workers who are by and large underpaid, and then on the other hand, threatening black workers with termination if they try to get the wage that they deserve. And this ultimately creates a society, right, with mass inequality along these racial lines, but also along income lines as well. And
Pitting us against each other.
Right, exactly. But also creating differential access to the criminal justice system itself, right? Even if we lived in a world where there are no racist police officers, where each police officer was genuinely, not necessarily didn't see color, but genuinely enforced the law the same irrespective of what you looked like. When it comes time for you to talk to, say, a public defender, or when it comes time for you to face a jury, or when it comes time to be looking at a plea deal, you are not in the same scenario as someone who can afford their own lawyer and who can afford to fight these charges in court. And so as a result, we see black and brown men pleading out to crimes they didn't commit because the alternative is basically taking it to trial and
they're just
certainly
fortunately coming from the
Right,
poverty classes.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Right.
So and as you say, your students aren't
Yeah,
dumb
no,
about
exactly.
this.
No,
They get this.
They get this, and a lot of
And
them
they-
want to change this. I mean,
So they
yeah.
are seeing you as supporting their well-being.
Yes, I mean, so
in their chosen profession.
yeah, I mean,
and
efforts
efforts to help the community.
and when I refuse to give exams in my classes because I think that they don't do much to teach students, and they really just riddle them with anxiety that's kind of unnecessary. So instead I assign them essays. I assign them a term paper, and I have them pick whatever topic they want, and the only requirement is basically they have to tie it to the economic theories that we learned in the class. And every class I've had multiple students bring up the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow,
Right.
and wanting to investigate the criminal justice system through that lens, and of course I encourage them to do so. So I mean, it's not like I'm teaching them something that they've never heard of or something that's completely out there. These students come to my class already being concerned about these issues. I mean, John Jay is a very progressive school, as you know, you teach there as well. And these students, they want to change the world. And this is why I love teaching at John Jay, is because these students are really dedicated and passionate about the issues that they care about. And
You're saying you've taught at NYU and
yeah, I've taught at NYU, I've taught at Long Island University, I've taught at Howard University, and John Jay is hands down my favorite school I've ever taught at. And it's because these students are so dedicated to changing the world and to building a world that everyone can participate and live in.
So when you hear commentators try to twist this all around,
Right.
and making you out to be some sort of whatever, I don't know,
Yeah.
psychotic
It's
monster who wants cops killed. I
Oh,
mean,
no.
this is totally
yeah, no, I mean,
future cops or present cops. Or
right.
It's so far from the reality
Right.
of your
My work, right? My activism and also my teaching. I mean, ultimately, I, as an anti-fascist, even hate violence. I really don't like that the focus has become on the spectacle of violence, and it's been a problem recently. This media attention to anti-fascist violence, because it's been bringing in people who don't really have any kind of grounding in anti-fascist theory or anarchist theory.
Let's take that back just a
Yeah.
little bit here. So you say your interest or your involvement in Antifa had started when?
Sure. So actually, it started with research. So when I was at Howard University studying for my master's, I had a history of economic thought class. The professor was a Marxist. He, similar to me, you could do any topic that you want as long as it pertained to the history of economic thought. I was generally bored by kind of mainstream economic theory at that point and didn't really want to do a history paper on that. I didn't want to do anything on Marxist economic theory because I didn't want my professor to nitpick everything I said with his communist commentary. And so as a result, I decided to do a paper on analyzing fascist economic theory.
Okay.
So-
and help our audience understand all of this.
Yeah, so fascist economic theory, by and large, is kind of secondary to its political and cultural theories. So fascists believe that the economic fate of a nation is crucially tied to the cultural constitution of that nation, and that if a nation is allowed to degenerate, if diversity of thought and diversity of cultures are allowed to persist, that the nation will necessarily decay, and then the result will be economic decay.
Destroys the unity and
Exactly.
Economic decay.
Right.
And that concentration of wealth or concerns economic in the corporation or the specific individual or
Right.
dictator.
So this is the thing: is that
Yeah.
by and large, the economic configuration is kind of an afterthought. So generally speaking, fascists at
Why
least.
do you say that? And
So-
yeah, go ahead.
Well, Hitler, for instance, claimed that economics was secondary in Mein Kampf. This is
Right.
something he explicitly said. And also the economic theories of fascists were not static. So Mussolini constantly changed what he said was the proper economic path. So originally he was kind of like a quasi-libertarian. By the end of his regime, he actually embraced what was known as corporatism. So corporatism is basically where you have the state mediating between industry associations and labor unions. And the labor unions are labor unions that are officially recognized by the fascist state, and the industry associations are also officially recognized by the fascist state, where the fascist state is basically in the position of negotiating both prices and wages in the market. So basically you have a free market on the demand side, but on the supply side it's very heavily regulated.
By the state.
By the state, exactly.
And in the form of one man?
Right, yeah, so in the form of a,
Generally,
a one-man dictatorship, generally speaking. And
Sounds
this-
like some stuff that's a little bit going on.
Yeah, yeah,
Just
I mean,
got-
for
well,
sure.
okay. We'll get to that, yeah.
Yeah, and so my anti-fascist work started with this research.
I see. Okay.
So I mean, I'm not one of those people that just kind of punches whoever I disagree with. I actually have a pretty solid grounding that I've been continuing my research for the past 6 years. And
So take that Tucker
Yeah.
Carlson, that's what he...
exactly. I mean, he wants to
See.
say that it's all about just me disagreeing with it. No,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
right.
we actually do take, anti-fascists actually do take the time by and large to research who it is that we're opposing. And so,
And the ones that we saw in Charlottesville
Right.
literally saved
yeah,
Cornel West
For
and,
sure.
and many of the
for sure. And
religious leaders there, yeah.
right, and so from there, I was also involved with the Occupy movement in D.C. So we had Occupy K Street there. K Street being the street where most of the lobbying
Right.
firms
This was at Howard,
operate.
when you were at Howard?
When I was at Howard, yes.
Right.
So about a year later, the Aryan Nations, which is now a defunct group, they were a Christian identity group. So Christian identity is this weird form of white nationalism that takes, that believes that the tribes of Israel actually are not, or the Jews presently are not descended from the tribes of Israel, that they're actually fake Jews, and that the real tribes of Israel migrated to the British Isles,
Really?
and that in fact the true descendants of Israel are actually Anglos. Which
Well, that's
it's
quite a
bizarre.
distortion.
Right, exactly.
So you got to tell the
So-
Israelis that. And
Yeah, exactly. So
maybe the promised land is not quite
right. So they unironically will reference the Bible and Mein Kampf and claim that those two books actually refer to each other. That both Mein Kampf refers to the Bible and the Bible also refers to Mein Kampf.
We're talking about what? Several hundred people here?
So this was
Thousands, or-
so the Aryan Nations was not a very large group at the time when they organized their march in D.C., which was against this so-called white genocide in South Africa. They managed to get only about 15 to 20 people to show up.
Okay.
So they showed up in a charter bus that was driven by a black man, and they had about 15 to 20 people. Were surrounded by all sorts of riot cops. and this was where when we started Smash Racism DC. So we started Smash Racism DC specifically to oppose these fascists that were coming to.
And you were part of this.
And I was one of the co-founders.
Okay, and the goal was, or what?
And the goal was
yeah.
to basically oppose these fascists, not to get to deny them a public platform, because ultimately, when they have a public platform, what they're not just engaging in speech. This isn't an aesthetic act, right? This is an act of attempting to gain political power. Right. So when a fascist speaks in public, what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring people into their fold so that they can increase their numbers and ultimately find ways to actually gain political power, both
by making spectacles and
making
various ways
right,
to gain attention,
but also to create a social space. Right. I mean. As any activist knows, the work does not happen because you are saying things. The work happens because you're building relationships with people, because you are coordinating and strategizing.
It's a drama.
Right. It's beyond the drama. It's also you're doing things behind the scenes like lobbying your legislators and stuff like that. So, for instance, the National Policy Institute managed to get the Heritage Foundation in 2013 to endorse their immigration plan.
But okay, I get it. I
Right.
think okay. So it's the argument is that you sort of try to stop this
Right.
embryonic
Right.
attempt
Exactly.
at fascism by meeting it head on,
Right.
before it can flourish.
And
but doesn't that also begin to get us into the question of free speech and all
right.
that? Sort of
I don't
stuff?
think it does.
No?
And,
Tell
and
us
the
why.
reason I don't think it does is because ultimately we're talking about a movement that has absolutely no problem eliminating every political right that we enjoy. So, for instance, altright.com on July 28th of this year published an article authored by a man named Vincent Law, where the headline was, "If we want to keep free speech, get rid of democracy." And they reduced free speech, much like Tucker Carlson, and it seemed like you were insinuating a little bit, did, which is to reduce speech to an aesthetic act, right? An act of simply being able to say a thing. And the argument that they presented in this article was effectively, in an authoritarian state, because there is rampant political repression, the only kinds of speech that you can engage in is non-political speech. And therefore, the issue of free speech is a non-issue.
Right. Everything's it's watered down.
It's watered down.
Really doesn't make any difference.
Right. The only kinds of speech that you can
But
engage
we're talking about 15 or 20 people here.
Right.
But again, was there a real
Right.
fear that
Well,
somehow, if
so-
allowed to, they would
Right. And I mean, and
mushroom into a
and I think the last 10 years have
Tea
proven
Party?
it. We managed to show up with about 300 people from the community.
Okay.
A really wide range of people, both activists as well as people that have never taken the streets for anything before in their life.
Right.
We got Jewish groups to come out, church groups to come out, socialist parties, etc. And so their plan was to do a half-hour march to the Capitol building and do a 2-hour speak out at the Capitol. Because of our presence, where we did sit-down blockades at every intersection, their half-hour march became a 2-hour-long march. And because of how numerous and loud we were at the Capitol building, their speak out, they decided to call it quits after about 10 minutes because no one could hear what they were saying. To me, that is an anti-fascist victory. That is the ideal anti-fascist victory, one that does not involve physical confrontation whatsoever, but still enables the community to stand up against.
What about campus speakers?
Right.
That disrupting the same thing operating there?
Yeah.
With the Ann Coulters?
Right. So
what do you do there?
the campus speaker thing is interesting. Milo Yiannopoulos, I think,
Right.
is a prime example of why they're so dangerous. So he gave a speech, I believe it was last year or the year before, at American University. And one of my friend, well, she wasn't my friend at the time, she's my friend now, organized a counter demonstration against him.
Okay.
As a result, he and his cronies found out who was behind this. They outed her. She's trans. They outed her being trans. She was subject to harassment from the student body. Ultimately forced to leave campus. I believe she ended up coming back, but ultimately forced
Physically threatened?
Yeah, I mean, threatened with the same sort of harassment that I've been facing. You know, death threats and that sort of
deal
thing.
with too. Okay.
But ultimately, right, it interfered with her ability to be able to go to school and to get an education.
Right.
Right. So I mean, what these speakers do is they create an atmosphere, a very hostile atmosphere for students, right, where they make it okay for students to target other students. For harassment, for bigotry, for death threats, and ultimately create a hostile environment for everybody who's not a white man. And I mean, it's the university, any university's duty, right, to stand up to these sorts of hostile environments. Like Title IX mandates that universities create a safe environment free of harassment and
so they
assault.
the university should be
should be considering
asking them to speak. Is that what you're saying?
The universities should be
responsible.
They should be considering who they invite on their campus and whether these speakers create a hostile environment. I mean, ultimately, students are protected by the Civil Rights Act.
But they're also brought in by various student
Sure.
groups. So the students,
For sure.
some students want them there, some don't, and the administration position is then to what? Mediate.
I mean, I think it's the duty of the administration
To make sure it's safe.
to make sure it's safe, to make sure that they are not creating a hostile environment for their students.
Okay, so you have extra security. You allow these people to speak, and you challenge them in debate and dialogue and whatever.
They're not interested in debate, though.
Well,
they're interested in giving death threats. They're interested
Right.
in having they're interested in having someone on a stage that gives them the license to send these death threats.
Okay,
You know?
and again, I just want to understand your position would be to, if the administration is not going to, in your position,
Right,
be
I mean-
responsible enough and they're there, then
ultimately
you will try to
it's
shut them down.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
okay.
this is ultimately, and this is not like something that's ad hoc. And this is what is, I think, the major difference between fascists and anti-fascists, is that fascists don't organize the same way that anti-fascists do. So anti-fascists organize according to horizontal consensus-based structures, where we use affinity groups, which are small groups of people that are networked by what are known as spokes councils. So a spokes council is basically a public meeting space where these affinity groups or larger organizations appoint an individual temporarily to represent them to the larger body, and then these organizations make calls for mutual aid or provide support for other organizations. But the point is that ultimately it is a broad-based community decision, not the decision of individual actors with particular forms of bigotry. Whereas fascists, on the other hand, they don't organize in this way. When they do have organizations, they're very top-down. So Richard Spencer and the various people that showed up at the Charlottesville rally, for instance, they have their own personal security now, and they are directing things according to their own cults of personality. Anti-fascists integrate themselves with the communities that they claim to represent when they're successful, and ultimately engage democratically, directly with these communities to serve the needs of these communities.
Okay, and if it calls for it, as it happened in Charlottesville, to be involved in what do you call it? Defensive
Physical
violence?
yeah.
Physical,
I would say physical
violence
confrontation.
to confrontation.
Yeah.
To protect.
To protect the communities, exactly, as they ask. And this is important, that oftentimes anti-fascists do show up and are specifically asked not to engage in violence. So this was the case at the Juggalo March that I attended 2 weeks ago.
We're not asked to participate. Okay.
Right, we were.
But they were there.
We were there to show
force
for solidarity, etc.
Okay.
But no, and we were like the code of conduct that the Juggalos affiliated with the Juggalo March had set was no physical or verbal violence, and we abided that because that was what was asked of us.
Right, but you were also saying before, so that there are Antifa groups that are acting what? In ways that you
I would say that
believe
there are individuals that are now identifying with Antifa that aren't part of groups that are seeing this violence on television, and they're just coming in for the thrill-seeking of punching a Nazi in the face and then going home, not recognizing, first of all, that doing so puts people in danger, right? I mean, when you take that sort of risk, you're not.
Are they planted, or do you think they're?
I don't think so. I think it's just people that
Just
are
why?
opposed to fascists but don't have any connection with the communities that they are involved with. They see
And then
this
Trump, of course, can start
right.
ranting about the bad dudes.
Exactly.
On the left too. So
But I mean, I guess the spectacle of anti-fascist violence has been drawing people in that don't really have any connection to these communities and do put people in danger. I mean,
how are you trying to regulate that?
Yeah. So when we go into these sorts of scenarios, we go in not only with the black masks or whatever, but we also go in with street medics. We go in with court support, with legal funds, with medical funds now, unfortunately, et cetera. We really do plan for every contingency in the hopes that, of course, we don't have to resort to them. And when these random people come in and don't do any of this organization, it ultimately puts a cost on the rest of the community. And I mean, this is something that I've been talking to the media about. I mean, I talked to the person in the Hill about this. Instead of saying any of this stuff that I told her, she instead printed that I unequivocally support anti-fascist violence, which again is not true, as I'm telling you.
Much more nuanced.
Right. And I mean, it's a problem because it ultimately it really defeats the purpose of anti-fascism, which is to protect the communities.
In these efforts to protect, now you've been in this for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. What have you been noticing? Are the fascists growing? Are they escalating?
For
they
sure.
are.
For sure.
And Antifa is also growing in response?
Yes, it seems so.
So we are moving more and more toward what? Larger confrontations? More violent?
No, I hope not.
What do you think?
To be honest, so what one of my one anti-fascist activist who goes by the name L. Armageddon, she's out in Oakland. One thing that she pointed out, which was a remarkable insight as far as I'm concerned, is that generally speaking, when the presence of anti-fascists are large, particularly in comparison to that of Nazis, the likelihood of violence goes down. The more of the community that shows up in opposition
as a symbol of force, not necessarily
not necessarily
at that point.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we saw this in Boston.
That deters it.
Right.
Boston.
And we saw this in Boston, that the broad support from the community against the so-called free speech rally, it didn't result in violence because there's no need. When you have the community out saying that fascists are not welcome, then there's no need for violence because the community gave a mandate. What fascists seek to do with this, with their public demonstrations, in addition to trying to recruit, they're also testing the waters of the various places that they go. So it's important to note that the Charlottesville thing was not the first time that they showed up. That they had done so about a month prior.
This was a vulnerable community.
They felt and they actually have a project called Pioneer Little Europe. Where
Say it again?
Pioneer Little Europe. It's sometimes abbreviated PLE, which is a project that Nazis try to engage in. They're not very successful with it, where they literally try to take over towns and establish them as whites-only enclaves. So there was a man by the name of Craig Cobb who tried to do this in a town, Leith, North Dakota. It was a town of about 24 people. He bought 2 plots of land there and invited his Nazi buddies to move into town. And then immediatally started putting up
the 10 or 15 or so that were still left over.
Exactly.
No, okay.
So he put up some his swastikas and all
North
this other
Dakota,
stuff. Within a couple months, they were patrolling the neighborhood with rifles. And anti-fascists heard about this. They moved into the town too and started organizing the local community. And in concert with the local community, strategized a way to get them out of town. And the way that they ended up doing it was actually legislative, which for anarchists, I guess, is kind of weird. But they decided to pass a town ordinance that prohibited anyone from occupying a building that didn't have running water. As a result, those buildings that they bought were condemned, and they demolished them, and the Nazis had to flee town.
To go to South Dakota. Or something.
Exactly. So, and the interesting thing is that this is not the first time that he tried to do this. So Craig Cobb himself is actually banned from the country of Estonia for trying to do this. So I mean, this is something that that Nazis have explicitly been trying to do for a very long time. And so when anti-fascists are organizing with these communities, we recognize and try to articulate this very real threat that if you let the Nazis come into your town unopposed, they will not stop coming, and they will try to set up shop and try to reconfigure your town so they are the only ones that are welcome.
So it's a consistent philosophy of pushing out.
Yeah, it's
making sure that they can't get a foothold.
And it's very much in line with their philosophy on life in general. I mean, this is the same sorts of groups that embrace the kind of the men's rights activism or the manosphere, the pickup artist communities or whatever. Where they also, in the books on being a pickup artist, they advocate basically violating women's boundaries in small and subtle ways in order to get them to accept a violation of their boundaries so that they can eventually coerce them into sexual activity. And this is the same sort of thing. It's this boundary pushing where people are willing to have their boundaries slowly pushed and being willing to be made to feel more and more uncomfortable until because their boundaries have been pushed so far, they have no way that they can resist anymore. So anti-fascists exist to help people recognize that you need to start resisting now, otherwise by the time that you finally realize that this is not okay anymore, you're not going to be able to have a leg to stand on.
Now, a couple of things. So getting back to Cornell's statement there, and getting back to actually the classroom with your police officer students.
Sure.
As Cornell put it, the police weren't there.
Right.
They advocated. So what role should they play? Should they be more active in the separation?
I don't know. I mean, like, the police have their job. I don't know what they think their role is. What I do know is that fascists have been infiltrating police departments for quite a long time. The FBI actually put out a report indicating this. So for instance, there's a police officer in Philadelphia who's still on the force. He's been under investigation twice and has been cleared. And he has a Nazi tattoo on his forearm. It's what is known as a Reichsadler, which is the same symbol that it was on the hat of the SS soldiers. And he is still on the force, and they don't see this as a problem. And this is the kind. I mean, this is ultimately what we're up against. Is we're up against a movement that actively advocates for what they call lone wolf violence. So the notion of lone wolf is not actually a designation by the FBI. It was actually coined by Tom Metzger, who is a white nationalist who started the organization White Aryan Resistance, which recently folded. And they advocate basically low-level independent forms of terrorism. Where, for instance, like Dylan Roof or Wade Michael Page or Anders Breivik, right? They operate without any coordination from anyone else. This is ultimately
sort of traumas and disasters.
Right, and they seek to basically engage in these sorts of low-level terrorism in order to instigate what they call a race war. And sometimes they call it racial holy war, even. And the interesting thing too is that these tactics, these white nationalist tactics, are being adopted by other terrorist organizations. So, for instance, ISIS is adopting the tactics of white nationalists, and Al Qaeda as well, to an extent, also adopted their tactics of this low-level independent terrorism, cell-based or individual-based forms of violence, and also kind of trying to eliminate, the way that ISIS describes it is trying to eliminate the gray zone, right, where you have to choose a side, that you can't be in the middle, but choosing a side basically means choosing between two forms of authoritarian violence. In the case of white nationalists, the sides that they see them pushing are either them or the state, which they claim is, of course, run by a shadow government, right, of Jews and et cetera.
Whatever, commies and so on.
Exactly.
The role of anarchistic thought in all of this, because you mentioned that.
So
Tell
this
us
is
a little
right.
about
So this is
where
the
this all
basis.
fits in.
Right. So the anarchist thought is the basis of our organizing style. Right. Is this horizontal consensus-based process, and consensus-based democracy as opposed to the sort of democracy the electoral democracy that we're familiar with today.
Participatory democracy.
Right.
I mean,
So this is
using
participatory democracy, but
term from the 60s.
right. The consensus part is the important part, which is that if something that is being proposed harms you, or you see it as potentially harming you or your community, you have the right to block that proposal and to try to renegotiate that proposal so as to mitigate that harm that you see. And this is significantly different from like electoral democracy or referendum, where basically
blocking, when you say
blocking. So this
argue, be able to convince
right,
others.
So this is basically in a consensus-based process, if I make a proposal and that proposal will harm someone else, they have the right to basically say, this proposal cannot go through because it harms me. I have a blocking concern, would be what they say. And of course, it would have to be an actual articulable concern, and in which case, it is incumbent upon me and the other people that are proposing this thing to address the concerns that this person has, so that those concerns or that the harm that this person sees does not occur. And this is hugely different,
sort
right?
Of veto.
Exactly. It's a one-person veto, and it's huge, right? And it's hugely important because ultimately, and this is both anti-fascist and anarchist, we see every society as surviving on the basis of its diversity, right? That uniformity is effectively death, and this is true on a biological level too, where if
Antifa.
Yeah.
Right. That's
right.
quote.
That I mean,
okay.
and this is
the opposite, well, obviously, of the fascists.
As a fascist, right? That want to see uniformity. They want to see kind of like the new fascist man or whatever.
Right.
And but we recognize that each of us can't survive without all of us. That we need the diversity of community.
This is a global world.
Exactly. This is a global world that we need a diversity of community in order to be able to survive and to thrive and to grow.
So when you hear Donald Trump and the argument, the alt-right, help us understand that as well in terms of conjunction with the people you're dealing with. What is the connection?
With Donald Trump and the alt-right?
Well, the alt-right and I mean, does he, when Cornell talks about we are entering into a new neo-fascist American version.
I don't think
is Donald Trump the face of that?
Yeah, I don't think Cornel West is actually being hyperbolic. I'm not sure if he's coming from the same research that I am. But what I can tell you is that Donald Trump has actually embraced at least the rhetorical style of some of, not the alt-right, but some of their affiliates in France.
So you would categorize him as a neo-fascist in the making, or
I don't
know
if he's a neo-fascist. What I do know is that he is at least adopting their rhetoric and their sort of worldview. So over the past 2 decades,
because he truly believes it, but we hear also that he's such a narcissist.
Well, this is.
So is it?
So let me kind of give you the background here.
Yeah.
So
and the business interests
for the past 2 decades, and particularly the past decade, what has come to be known as the alt-right has been organizing with fascists abroad, particularly in Europe. And among those are what is known as the European New Right, or in France, the Nouvelle Droite. And because of the hate speech laws there, they are forced to reconfigure the fascist rhetoric that comes both from the US alt-right as well as the fascist intellectual history that they are embracing as their own. They're forced to re-articulate that in a way that gets around these hate speech laws. So there's a speech by Guillaume
or benign.
Right. Well, not necessarily benign, but just different sorts of wording. So there's this speech by Guillaume Fay. He's addressing American Renaissance, which is a a white nationalist or magazine. They primarily focus on crime statistics as it relates to black people.
Okay.
And Guillaume Faye explained to this meeting that basically because of the hate speech laws, he's not allowed to denigrate Arabs, he's not allowed to denigrate black people because those are races. So what he does instead is he denigrates immigrants and he denigrates Muslims because you can denigrate religions and you can denigrate immigration status there. And he uses those as basically stand-ins for blacks and Arabs. And Donald Trump has very much adopted this sort of rhetorical style where when he wants to talk about Latinos negatively, he will say immigrants instead. If you go back through all of his speeches, you will never find a single instance where he denigrates Latinos as a race. But you will find several instances where he implies that sort of denigration by using a stand-in term like immigrants.
Are we giving him a lot of credit here
No.
to have this coherent worldview, or is it something that is sort of
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing
grown out of his own narcissistic
so this is the thing is
attempt to make a lot of money
because of
and divide and conquer?
well, so because
well,
of
go ahead,
because of this this manner of engagement the French New Right has been engaged in, they have actually managed to make inroads with more mainstream currents of the right wing, particularly in the United States. So in France, in the United States, Guillaume Faye is known as an anti-Semite. In France, he's known as a Zionist because he supports the state of Israel insofar as it is an ethno-state. And he is against Muslim immigration. And so as a result, right-wing Zionists flock to him and they embrace him and they take his message and then they bring it to the United States. And so we see increasingly
that influence in terms of foreign policy.
Foreign
here
policy
in the
in terms of domestic policy, even with respect to how to deal with crime. With respect,
ethnic cleansing by
yeah.
mass imprisonment.
Exactly. I mean, or as Richard Spencer would call it, peaceful ethnic cleansing, right?
Yeah.
There's not really much peaceful about that. But the point is that ultimately, because of this kind of nexus that the European New Right plays, the white nationalist right in the United States has managed to narrow the gap, or the ideological gap between them and more mainstream currents of the right that would call themselves maybe civic nationalists like Steve Bannon, or would call themselves even libertarians, and are libertarians that are worried about crime. And because of this, white nationalists have basically been able to co-opt more mainstream right-wing currents by virtue of kind of being able to recraft their language for broader appeal. And I think Trump, I don't know if he is doing this actively, if he knows that he's doing this, but he's certainly been embracing this form of rhetoric.
Interesting.
I have my suspicions that he's doing it intentionally only because he has a very, 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 very long history of being a racist person. So it's hard to tell.
And the advisors that he might have around him.
Yeah, like Stephen Miller, for instance.
Oh, Steve Miller, who's still right. Wow. So this hour has really flown by here, and we only have a minute or two. I can't believe it. Is there anything else you want to add? I think, and then hopefully you've had your side expressed in this hour. It's been fascinating. Anything else you want to add?
I mean, I would just say that one thing that we didn't really talk about was that the bulk of anti-fascist activity is not the protests. It's the research that happens behind the scenes. It's the infiltration of far-right groups. It is actively caring for your local communities.
Right.
So I mean, like a lot of anti-fascists also operate food not bombs and stuff like that. I mean, it really is about getting involved with your local community and doing things to build kind of community support and really a community feeling. I mean, ultimately, fascists flock to fascism because they feel isolated, because they feel alone, because they feel wronged. And it's up to us to ultimately try to soothe those wounds before people become fascists in the first place.
Michael, this has been incredible. I want to thank you very much for enlightening the audience, and it's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and wish you all the best. And I, for one, would love and hope that you're going to be able to still teach at John Jay College.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. We'll see you next week. Take care.